Good evening. It's a delight for me to welcome you all to Court of Appeals Hall for our program tonight. I do so on behalf of myself and my colleagues, Carmen Beauchamp-Saparik, the Senior Associate Judge, Victoria Graffio, the next Senior Associate Judge, Susan Phillips-Reed, who you're going to meet in a minute, Judge Robert Smith, who's right there in the front, Judge Eugene Pickett, who is judging a moot court competition up in Saratoga tonight, and Theodore Jones, who is sitting on the end here. And my job is easy, to just say welcome. This is a great series. It's always interesting, the presentation, and then we'll have time for a little discussion afterwards. And I want to thank Susan Phillips-Reed, I'm going to introduce you now, for putting together this program and really being the dean of these programs. And she'll introduce our terrific speaker, Professor Perino, and who has a great tale to tell. So, Susan, you want to come up?
Michael Perino is currently the Dean George W. Matheson Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law in New York. I'm sure no one could have figured that out, that association. Professor Perino's primary areas of scholarly interests are securities regulation and litigation, corporations, class actions, and judicial decision-making. He's sort of in the right place for that tonight. He has also taught at Cornell, Columbia, and Stanford, where he was a lecturer and co-director of the Roberts Program in Law, Business, and Corporate Governance. Professor Perino is the author of the leading treatise on the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act, as well as numerous articles and monographs on securities, regulation, securities fraud, and class action litigation. He has testified in both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives and is frequently quoted in the media on securities and corporate matters. He's been profiled in the Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, Business Week, the Financial Times, Forbes, Fortune, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many others, and has appeared on NPR, the BBC, Bloomberg Television, and CNBC. We are pleased that Professor Perino accepted the court's invitation to deliver our spring 2011 Court of Appeals lecture. His talk focuses not on his treatise on the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act, as I'm certain many in the audience are relieved to learn, but on his latest book, The Hellhound of Wall Street, How Ferdinand Pecora's Investigation of the Great Crash Forever Changed American Finance. In the wake of the financial calamities of 2008, Hellhound is timely. Indeed, it was named one of the best business books of 2010 by Bloomberg Business Week and the Library Journal. Hellhound is also exceedingly well written. As Reuters put it, the author plots Pecora's improbable rise to stardom like a Hollywood screenwriter. Hellhound has also been described by Business Week as page-turning history and by Publishers Weekly as crackerjack legal drama. The Economist said the book deftly sets the drama of the Senate hearings within the wider cultural and political ferment and is potent testimony to the way in which one person can help crystallize the interpretation of an event. I'm sure you are anxious to hear from Professor Perino, so please join me in welcoming him.
All right. Thank you very much, Judge, and thanks to the rest of you for having me up here as well. I will take down the St. John's advertisement right now. Okay. Oop. Sorry. Minor technical difficulties. Here we go, from the beginning. All right. So what I want to do is start with a quote. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Now, some of you might recognize that quote. That's Abraham Lincoln. That's from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And what I like about this quote is that it can mean two very different things. On the one hand, this could be the motto for a demagogue trying to seize power for him or herself. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, though, the other possibility is that this is a recipe for how to pass constructive reform legislation. Well, my book is set primarily in the winter of 1933. And in the winter of 1933, there were a fair number of reformers running around and a fair number of demagogues as well. Let's start with the demagogues first. Huey Long. Huey Long was the virtual dictator of Louisiana, and in 1933 he was a U.S. senator, haranguing his ways through the halls of the Capitol. In 1933, there was Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin was the radio priest. He was the biggest thing on radio in 1933. It was said that in some neighborhoods, on a summer day, on a Sunday, you could walk down the street and not miss a moment of his on-air sermons because he would be coming out of each open window that you passed walking down the street. He has also been called the father of hate radio, because by 1933, his weekly on-air sermons had become increasingly anti-Semitic. Finally, on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. So there were a fair number of demagogues running around in 1933. I want to turn to a different power change, one that was a little bit closer to home. And if you'll indulge me for a second, what I'll do is read a little bit from the introduction of the book to give you a sense of the setting for the book. Saturday, March 4th, 1933, was one of those raw March days when it seems that spring will never come. The thick layer of steel-gray clouds sheathing the sky threatened rain, and a northwest wind whipped across Capitol Hill. Sunshine broke through on occasion, but it was dull and fleeting and did little to relieve the dreariness of that damp, chilly day. Sounds vaguely familiar, right? Historians would later pinpoint that winter as the nadir of the Great Depression. But Americans hardly needed to be seers to realize that the economy could not get much worse. 38 states had closed all their banks, and everywhere else withdrawals were sharply curtailed. Outright bank failures numbered in the thousands annually. In those days before deposit insurance, 1 in 4 families lost their life savings. The economy was in full retreat. Industrial production was half of what it had been just 4 years earlier, and unemployment was an appalling 25%. Farm incomes were decimated after a decade of plummeting crop prices. Shanty towns of the dispossessed, sarcastically dubbed Hoovervilles, dotted the landscape, and bread lines stretched around many blocks. Homes were foreclosed, renters evicted, and signs of malnutrition among school children were increasingly evident. On Friday, March 3rd, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 86% off its wildly inflated pre-crash peak of September 1929. At the end of that trading day, the New York Stock Exchange announced that it would be closed indefinitely. In the midst of that economic chaos, a shivering crowd of at least 100,000 gathered near the east portico of the Capitol to hear Franklin Roosevelt's plan of attack. Some perched in the icy bare trees, others crammed in bleachers or crowded atop adjacent buildings. Pundits from all points of the political spectrum were openly calling for Roosevelt to assume dictatorial powers to address the crisis. In some parts of the country, the possibility of revolution was openly discussed, and Lloyd's of London was doing a booming business in riot and civil disturbance insurance. Washington still had an ominous wartime feel. Government buildings were heavily guarded, police patrols ringed the White House, and machine gun nests were strategically placed along the inaugural parade route. After being sworn in by Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, Roosevelt turned to address the gathered crowd, and he told them that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Positioning himself in stark contrast with Herbert Hoover, who sat stonily just a few feet away, Roosevelt pledged action and action now. What's interesting about that speech, that's the line we all know from it, right? You have nothing to fear but fear itself. If you go back and you look at the films of that speech, you find that line came very early in the speech, and it was almost totally ignored by the crowd. It got no reaction whatsoever from the crowd. The crowd actually didn't get going until a few minutes later. A few minutes later, when Roosevelt said, "Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men." Applause erupted for the first time when Roosevelt proclaimed, "The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths." Somewhere in Manhattan, perhaps sitting by the radio in his Upper West Side apartment, Ferdinand Pecora must have been smiling. It was Pecora, the man the reporters called the Hellhound of Wall Street, and the Senate hearings he'd wrapped up just 2 days earlier, that had made those lines true. Ferdinand Pecora. Not many people have heard of Ferdinand Pecora today. As a matter of fact, when I started writing this book, I sort of took an informal poll of nearly everyone I knew, and almost to a person, no one had ever heard of Ferdinand Pecora. That was not always the case. In 1933, Ferdinand Pecora was a media superstar. The results of his investigation of Wall Street were regularly splashed across the front pages of newspapers around the country. And there were the kind of puff pieces normally associated with movie stars. We got to learn that, when he stayed up late doing his investigation, doing the work for his investigation, he liked to take breaks with bowls of ice cream. He favored expensive cigars and pinochle, and his favorite sport was golf. It was the kind of puff pieces not normally associated with a Senate lawyer. My argument in the book is that the acclaim Pecora garnered was justified because the investigation he led fundamentally changed the relationship between Wall Street and Washington. When Pecora took the stage, and I think it's fair to call it a stage, in that winter of 1933, it was a very different time when it comes to financial regulation. There was some banking regulation. The Federal Reserve had been created already. But when it came to the business of selling securities, there was not a single law, not a single regulation that governed, not one from Washington anyway, that governed how Wall Street operated. And Ferdinand Pecora and Roosevelt, I suppose, changed all that. In Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, and then in the year following, Congress passed and Roosevelt signed a flurry of banking and securities regulation. There was the Banking Act of 1933, better known for its co-sponsors, Carter Glass and Henry Steagall. Glass-Steagall, as some of you know, did a couple of things. It separated commercial from investment banking, something that was only repealed in 1999. But it also created federal deposit insurance, perhaps the most important structural reform to emerge out of the New Deal. In 1933, Congress, in that first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933, the very first law that governed how Wall Street sold securities to investors. And then a year later, Congress passed the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which, among other things, created the Securities and Exchange Commission. Pecora made it all possible because his investigation created the sensational headlines necessary to galvanize public opinion for reform. FDR and the other New Dealers drew a direct link between the wrongdoing Pecora uncovered and their ability to push through reform legislation. Pecora won Lincoln's battle for public sentiment. And once he did that, Congress really didn't have a choice but to pass the legislation that FDR was trying to push through. Now, most congressional hearings take the name of the committee chairman, but Pecora's stellar performance was so dominating, his questioning was so riveting, his investigation was so thorough that these hearings became universally known as the Pecora hearings. Now, fast forward a few years, fast forward in particular to the spring of 2009. Then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi invokes Pecora's name and says we should have a new, she called it a Pecora commission, it wasn't a commission, but we'll forgive her for that. We should have a new Pecora commission to find out what happened on Wall Street. And a month later, Congress created the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, chaired by former California Treasurer Phil Angelides. Now, Phil Angelides, when he was appointed as chairman of this commission, said he was keeping a copy of Pecora's memoirs, a book called Wall Street Under Oath, on his bedside table. And he said his goal, like Pecora's goal, was to, let me get the quote right, to deepen the national dialogue about the need and the shape of reform. Now, Phil Angelides may in fact have kept the book on his bedside table. I am not quite sure he actually opened it. The commission wrapped up its hearings last fall. You probably didn't notice they were done. There was a bit of flurry of interest in the committee when they released their report in January on the causes of the financial crisis, but most of that interest was focused on the fact that they couldn't actually agree on what the causes of the financial crisis were, and we had a three-way split among the commissioners as to what exactly the causes were. All very interesting and fun to pick on, I suppose, but I think in some ways beside the point. Because Pecora wrote a report too, but the report wasn't the important thing. The investigation was the important thing. The hearings were the important thing. And as far as I could tell, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's investigation, well, it certainly generated nowhere near the interest that the Pecora hearings did, and it had no discernible impact whatsoever on the shape of financial reform, the Dodd-Frank Act that was recently enacted. So one question I suppose that's worth asking is, how is it that Pecora was able to succeed so spectacularly when the FCIC failed so miserably? I think there are three reasons for that, which I'll talk about now. And the first one I want to mention is perhaps in some ways the simplest answer. Pecora was a superb lawyer. For those of you who are lawyers, if you go back and you read these hearing transcripts, you just have to admire his skills as a lawyer. He had spent a dozen years as a prosecutor in New York. He knew his way around the courtroom. He was reputed to be one of the best cross-examiners of his day. He had an absolutely amazing memory. He seemed to remember every scrap of evidence, every little bit of testimony. And so when some banker would get on the stand and try to duck and dodge the questions, Pecora was right there to pin them down. He was relentless. The Hellhound of Wall Street was something like the pit bull of Wall Street. He would ask the same question 4, 5, 6 times until he got what he knew was the right answer. And he didn't care who he was questioning. He was not one who was willing to take it easy on the rich and the powerful. Perhaps the highlight of the hearings, although I have to say not the focus of the book, was when J.P. Morgan, this is J.P. Morgan Jr., Jack Morgan, appeared before the committee in May of 1933. J.P. Morgan, the investment banking firm at that time, was sort of the most mysterious, the most powerful of the private investment banking firms. They were the Goldman Sachs of their day, if you will. And this was, part of the media sensation, the hoopla over these hearings. They actually brought extra telegraph lines into the Senate office building so the reporters could get out their stories on time, and they were tacking up Klieg lights to the ceiling of the caucus room. Well, Morgan complained that Pecora treated him like a common horse thief, was his reaction to the whole episode. And, I'm not sure that was exactly a fair characterization of the questioning, but Pecora certainly didn't take it easy on Morgan or any of the other bankers of the day. But for all those theatrics, for all those forensic skills, what Pecora realized is that in order for him to be effective, he had to be the most prepared person in the room. And he was willing to do his homework. He used the committee's subpoena power liberally to pry documents out of recalcitrant bankers. And he spent innumerable sleepless nights reading briefing memos and going through evidence. So Pecora had the skills, the legal ability to get this job done. But Pecora was something else as well. Pecora really was an effective teacher. I watched a lot of the FCIC hearings, unfortunately. And there was one moment that really just, to me, crystallized the entire problem with those hearings. It was when Goldman Sachs, actually, people from Goldman Sachs were in the witness chair. They were talking about derivative securities. And the committee members were giving their droning on opening statements. And one of them said, I don't want to get lost in all of these intriguing stories. And to me, that was exactly the wrong approach and exactly the opposite of what Pecora would have done. I think what Pecora realized, much more so than the FCIC commissioners, is that those intriguing stories weren't just useless fluff. They were the vehicle through which he could explain how he could illustrate why more regulation of the financial industry was necessary. He devoted most of his time to spinning these compelling narratives out of this welter of economic details. What Pecora realized, I think, was that it was much more effective to take apart one transaction, to show how one set of Wall Street folks, one set of bankers, ripped off one set of clients in one set of transactions, rather than presenting reams of data on potential conflicts of interest on Wall Street. That was how Pecora created this clamor for reform. His genius really was his ability to convert these complex economic problems into really simple morality tales. Pecora, in short, had the bully pulpit. He had the skill and the ability and the desire to use it effectively. So that's number one. He knew what he was doing. Number two, I think, is that he had a receptive audience. Just like today, there were few fans of Wall Street when Pecora began to put bankers on the stand in 1933. Most everyone was predisposed to believe that bankers had behaved badly in the run-up to the 1929 stock market crash. But what was interesting, as I began to research this book, it was interesting to discover that when Pecora took over the hearings, much of that displeasure at Wall Street was really uninformed and unfocused. To the extent that there were specific complaints, most people were focused on sort of shady market operators, people who were participating in these manipulative pools or in short sellers. So, we're gonna attack the short seller. The problem with those people was that even before the hearings, almost everyone assumed that those people were going to do anything, legal or illegal, to make money. So when there were disclosures of shady practices among them, there was kind of a collective yawn. Tell us something we don't know already. What Pecora did, Pecora, I think, succeeded because he was able to crystallize that amorphous anger at Wall Street and turn it into hard facts and concrete evidence. And more than that, to show that Wall Street's derelictions weren't confined to those shady market operators. Pecora took on the elite leaders of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street. And he showed that they, too, had engaged in the same financial shenanigans. They, too, had put their own financial interests ahead of the financial interests of their customers. Now, this was a time when these men, and it was all men at the time, were supposed to be people of unimpeachable integrity. That was the view that most of the public had of them. And Pecora showed that it just wasn't true. It was as a result of that, it was in the wake of those revelations that meaningful reform legislation could pass. And that was the reaction we got from the American public to these kinds of disclosures. What's interesting, and this is the point I found most interesting in researching this book, this stage, this moment when public support was completely behind financial reform almost never happened. It's the winter of 1933. It appears to be the dying days of this investigation. The investigation has actually been going on for nearly a year. It started in March of 1932 at the behest of Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover might have been a little out of touch at this point. He thought the only thing standing in the way of the reforms that he was putting in place to pull the country out of depression were a bunch of short sellers on Wall Street. And he was convinced that some of those short sellers with democratic leanings, were engaged in a plot to drive down securities prices. And they were going to drive down securities prices to embarrass the administration and make it that much harder for Herbert Hoover to win re-election. As I said, he may have been a little out of touch at this point. So Hoover turns to his friend on the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, a former investment banker by the name of Frederick Walcott. And he asked Frederick Walcott to essentially, I want you to do an investigation of Wall Street. I want you to do an investigation of these short sellers. Now, Hoover wasn't interested in changing the laws. Matter of fact, he thought regulating the New York Stock Exchange was probably unconstitutional. All he wanted to do was to embarrass a couple of short sellers, sort of send them scurrying back to the corner so they would not interfere with his political plans. Well, that plan for this investigation didn't last very long because the chairman of this committee was a guy by the name of Peter Norbeck. Peter Norbeck, I have to say this about Peter Norbeck, a more unlikely chairman of the Senate Banking and Currency Committee you could not conjure than Peter Norbeck. Peter Norbeck was a former artesian well driller from South Dakota. He had almost no formal education. And I have to say, he barely understood how either banks or Wall Street worked. I have to read you what was one of my favorite discoveries when I went out to Vermilion, South Dakota to go through Peter Norbeck's papers. It's the early 1930s. Norbeck has become chairman of this committee essentially because of seniority. And for no other reason. As the country is plunging farther and farther into depression, more and more reform proposals are coming before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee. And Norbeck writes this to a friend at home. I really begin to think I am fortunate in the fact that part of the stuff goes over my head. I do not understand it all. If I did, maybe I wouldn't sleep at night. So that's Peter Norbeck. But Peter Norbeck knows a couple of things. First of all, he knows Peter Norbeck is a Republican, by the way. He's one of these sort of progressive prairie Republicans that used to exist, that don't exist anymore. And Peter Norbeck knows that he's up for re-election in 1932. He knows that this is going to be a big Democratic year. He calls it, after the election, the Democratic cyclone that swept the country. And he knows, well, his seat's probably pretty safe, but running against Wall Street in South Dakota in 1932 is probably a smart political move. So taking over this investigation of Wall Street certainly makes some political sense. But he also realizes something else. He writes, he confides to his campaign manager back home, whose name was Jimmy Stewart, of all things. He writes to Jimmy Stewart, he says, "This is my one chance to really do something big in Washington." He had been trying to push through agricultural reform for years and had always failed. But he saw this investigation as his one chance to really do something meaningful in Washington. And up until the winter of 1933, he had failed. The investigation had some early promise, but it really didn't accomplish much. Most people had written it off as a joke by the winter of 1933. He comes back to Washington after he's reelected. It's now the lame duck session of Congress. Everybody else on the committee says it's a waste of time to continue this investigation. The resolution authorizing the investigation ends when Congress ends, on March 4th, 1933. There's only a couple of months left. We don't have time to really engage in any meaningful investigation. We should just drop it. We have too many other things to do. But Norbeck continues to push on. He's got a big problem, though. He doesn't have a lawyer anymore. He fired the last one back in June of 1932. He's got to hire a new one. He offers the job to 4 people. All 4, well, 3 of them turn him down flat for a variety of political or other reasons. The 4th one takes the job, but then quits after a week in a huff, claiming that Norbeck is trying to sit on the lid of the investigation. And by this winter of 1933, actually, Norbeck is now being accused of being a timid investigator. The one who really wanted to push this investigation is being accused of not giving his investigators the tools they need to really take on Wall Street. The investigation seems to be in its last throes. And even Norbeck has given up at this point. He turns to Bainbridge Colby. Bainbridge Colby was the Secretary of State, the last Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, a lawyer. And he wants Colby not to engage in any more investigation. He wants Colby simply to write a report on what the investigation has uncovered over the previous year, a report that obviously is not going to say very much. Colby is uninterested in that job. But he says, you know, there's a guy I know. We used to be Bull Moose progressives together back in New York. He's a pretty good lawyer. His name's Ferdinand Pecora. Maybe you should give him a call. That's how Ferdinand Pecora gets the job. It is almost sheer luck that this happens. Pecora gets the call from Peter Norbeck. I have to say, Pecora lives for acclaim. He could care less about money. He can care less about a lot of things, but he does love the limelight for a variety of reasons. I think he was on the next train to Washington. He shows up in Norbeck's office. He asks to see the resolution for the investigation. He reads it over, and he turns to Norbeck. And there's an incredible amount of nerve in this, because Pecora doesn't know much about Wall Street either. He had been a criminal prosecutor in Manhattan. He's done some fraud investigations. He's put some bucket shop operators in jail and things like that. But he's never really taken on the inner workings of Wall Street. But he turns to Norbeck, and in sum and substance, he tells them, you know what? You've been going about this investigation all wrong. Forget about those market operators. Forget about those short sellers. Forget about those pool operators. Everybody knows they're crooks. What you really need to do is you really need to focus on the way in which Wall Street creates securities and sells them to the public. Let me take one more set of hearings. Now, at this point, it's late January 1933. There are effectively 5 weeks left in this investigation. And Pecora decides, and this is a bold move, that he's going to take on essentially the biggest banker of the day. He is going to subpoena Charles Mitchell. Charles Mitchell is the chairman of the board of a little outfit called the National City Bank of New York. Now, a few changes later, we know that as Citigroup. Not many people remember Charles Mitchell either, but let me read you a little bit about Charles Mitchell. Although he too has faded from memory, Mitchell was one of the best-known bankers of his day. Edmund Wilson, writing for the New Republic in 1933, said that Sunshine Charlie, that was his nickname, was the banker of bankers, the salesman of salesmen, the genius of the new economic era. The son of a produce dealer from gritty Chelsea, Massachusetts, Mitchell started off as a $10 a week clerk for Western Electric, moved to Wall Street, and made a fortune by fundamentally changing how it operated. He almost single-handedly pioneered the sale of stocks and bonds to middle-class investors. At the height of the bubble, he proclaimed the market had nowhere to go but up, and he was constantly on top of his salesmen, hectoring, berating, bullying, and cajoling them to sell more and more of the securities that Citibank, in his words, manufactured. He thought of Citibank as kind of like Ford. At first glance, the confrontation between Pecora and Mitchell hardly seemed like a fair fight. Mitchell had testified in congressional hearings before, including, by the way, in this very hearing. He had appeared as a witness in the spring of 1932, and he ran roughshod over the counsel for the committee at that point, and had emerged unscathed. Pecora had been committee counsel for just a few weeks and had almost no time to investigate the bank's complex and far-flung operations. Mitchell had the wealth and resources of Citibank at his disposal, and he strode into the hearing room surrounded by the most expensive legal talent in the country. Pecora had just cobbled together a tiny staff, all earning the same meager salary he did, $255 a month. Nobody was expecting very much from Pecora. Just 10 days after the Citibank hearings began, Mitchell would walk out alone, discredited, and disgraced. The bank quickly accepted his resignation. Pecora had shown that the bank and its securities trading arm had engaged in all sorts of unsavory behavior. It sold worthless bonds to investors without fully disclosing their risks, manipulated its own stock price and the stock prices of other companies, and lavishly compensated its executives as the country plunged into depression. It's almost impossible not to hear in today's financial problems the echoes of those hearings held more than 75 years ago. Most Americans then blamed Wall Street and the banking sector for the ills facing the country. There was populist outrage over excessive executive compensation. The markets seemed to be awash in manipulative short selling, in favorable deals for the fortunate few, and in dodgy loans that were foisted on unwary investors. Against the backdrop of the then exploding banking crisis, the disclosures were riveting and ultimately revolutionary. This was the turning point in which the relationship between Wall Street and Washington was forever altered. That, I think, is the third reason why Pecora was successful. He was a great lawyer. He had a receptive audience to his message about Wall Street abuse, but he gave that message at just the right time. Pecora's timing was impeccable because a week before Charles Mitchell takes the stand, William Comstock, the governor of Michigan, declares a statewide bank holiday. It was the spark that lit the banking crisis of 1933. Michigan was really the industrial heartland of the country at that point. The automobile industry was one of the industries that really drove the stock market in the 1920s. And people looked at the banks in Michigan shutting down. Remember, no deposit insurance. And they said if they can shut down in Michigan, they can shut down anywhere. And that banking crisis began to spread, first to Indiana, then to Ohio, and then across the country. Roosevelt comes into office on March 4th, 1933. Most of you probably know one of his first acts is to declare a nationwide bank holiday. What you may not realize is it was a fait accompli at that point. As I said earlier, when he gets up on that inaugural stand and gives his inaugural address, 38 of the 48 states have already shut down all of their banks. In the remaining 10 states, if you went to go take out money, the most you could get at any point was about 5 or 10%. The entire financial structure of the country seems to be disintegrating in front of everybody's eyes. And at just that moment, Pecora puts on the stand in Washington, the most famous banker of the day, the leader of not only the largest commercial bank in the country, but the largest investment bank in the country as well. And it was that confluence of events. I hate this phrase, but it really applies here. It was the Washington perfect storm. It was the precise combination of crisis and scandal that you need in order to pass financial reform legislation. And that's what happened in the winter of 1933. We should talk a little bit about what Pecora disclosed. And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, in part because I don't want to give away the entire book. So let me talk a little bit about Hugh Baker. Hugh Baker is the president of the National City Company. The National City Company is the investment banking arm, the securities selling arm of Citibank. And one of the ways that Citibank made boatloads of money in 1933 was not packaging subprime securities and selling them to investors, but rather selling the bonds of various shaky foreign governments. And the shaky foreign government that Pecora focused on in the second week of the hearings was Peru. Now, Hugh Baker, of course, got up on the stand, and Pecora asked him the simple question, well, you know, if you're thinking about selling the bonds of some country, what do you do? And, of course, Baker says, well, naturally, we send our best people down to the country, and they do a thorough analysis of everything that's going on, and only when everyone is satisfied that this is a security that we're willing to attach the good name of Citibank to, do we decide that we're going to sell it. Now, I suppose Baker should have known better. He had watched Pecora take apart Charles Mitchell for the first week of testimony. But Baker gets up there, and that's what he says. And, of course, Pecora begins simply by turning to all of the internal memoranda that his investigators had pulled out of the files at Citibank about the Peruvian offering. The government's finances were positively distressing. The government treasury, one report noted, was flat on its back and gasping for breath. It was unclear how the government continued functioning on the basis of its present income. The company had defaulted on loans in the past. It had been careless in the fulfillment of contractual obligations. The moral risk was not satisfactory. Was there anything, Pecora asked, in these reports that made Peru sound like a good candidate for a bond offering? It was not particularly enthusiastic, Baker responded. But of course, they sold the bonds anyway. And so Pecora turns to the offering document. And this is the reason I want to focus on this. I said before, the FCIC is proceeding on this parallel track completely apart from financial reform. Well, financial reform in the 1930s came right out of the Pecora hearings. Citibank advertised in national magazines, and they said, of course, we carefully studied the underlying values of all the bonds we offer, and we'll put those results before you, of course. Do you find any mention in the prospectus whatsoever, he asked Baker, of the bad credit record of Peru, which is embodied in the information I have read into the record from your files? No, I do not see anything. No statement or information was given to the American investing public concerning, Pecora liked to repeat himself for emphasis, concerning the bad debt record of Peru and its being a bad moral and political risk. No, sir. Pecora pulls out the next memo, the memo that says, revolution in Peru is a distinct possibility, a revolution that had actually come and turned those bonds into worthless pieces of paper. And Pecora turned to Baker and said, would the public have purchased these bonds if that information had been included in the bond prospectus? I doubt if they would. So that's a flavor for a little bit of what the investigation actually accomplished. The result was not terribly surprising. People were outraged at these disclosures. You have to remember, this is a time period when there were no disclosure rules. So what happened inside of Citibank was a mystery to everybody, including, I have to say, the Citibank shareholders. When Pecora disclosed how much the executives at Citibank were making in bonuses for selling these dubious securities to the investing public, this was news to the Citibank shareholders who had no clue about how much the officers were making. The public was outraged, and they wanted a change. And preferably voluntarily, we'll give you a chance to change yourselves, but if you don't do it, we will. Now, you can imagine that Wall Street was a little embarrassed about some of these disclosures, but that embarrassment didn't actually turn into anything like, oh, we agree that you should regulate us. The government should keep its hands off of me, was the response largely from Wall Street. And leading that charge was this rather imperious gentleman. This is Richard Whitney. Richard Whitney was, for many people, the face of Wall Street. He was the president of the New York Stock Exchange. And I encourage you to go onto YouTube and put in Richard Whitney. And you'll see a little video clip of him there. And he sounds like FDR's evil twin. He's got the same educational background, Groton, Harvard. He is this imperious gentleman, and he is outraged that Washington should come into the New York Stock Exchange and try to regulate it. Pecora's investigators show up, and Whitney looks down on them. And I can't do the accent, so I'm not even going to try. But he says, you gentlemen are making a grave mistake. The New York Stock Exchange is a perfect institution. Now, this was 5 years before Richard Whitney went to Sing Sing. It seems he was dipping his hands into the Widows and Orphans Fund at the New York Stock Exchange. So he went off to Sing Sing for investment. Nobody knew that at the time, of course. And he led a furious charge, a lobbying charge, against financial reform. One that failed at the end of the day. The 33 Act, that first securities law, sailed through quickly in that first 100 days. By 1934, when we were debating the creation of the SEC, Wall Street was in a little stronger position. They did carve back a little bit on financial reform. As a matter of fact, the lobbying effort looked much like the lobbying effort about Dodd-Frank in 2009 and 2010. Ultimately, of course, they were unsuccessful, and Wall Street finally got its cop on the beat. So that's the story of the investigation. And I want to just make one final point, and that is, you know, as somebody who teaches securities regulation, I knew the basic story of the investigation already. I didn't know the details about how tenuous the whole enterprise was, how much it almost didn't happen. But that's not what attracted me to this story for the first time. What really attracted to me this story was that, for me, this was so much more than just a Wall Street story. This was an immigrant success story. Pecora comes to this country in 1886. He's 5 years old. He arrives on the boat from Sicily with his family. He is as poor as any immigrant who's come to this country. He and his family settle in this basement tenement apartment in Chelsea. It's an apartment that's so dark, he says, we actually had to go outside to see what the weather was like. It was directly under the L on 9th Avenue. They are dirt poor. It is this tragic upbringing. He's got 2 older brothers. One of them dies of pneumonia. They're just kids at this point. The other dies drowning in the Hudson River, where the boys used to go swim to cool off in the hot summers. That leaves Pecora as the oldest child. Now, Pecora is a great student. He's although a bit of an outsider. His family settles in Chelsea, and as far as you can tell, he's the only Italian within miles. And everybody calls him Wop and Guinea and all of that stuff. But he excels at school. He's actually valedictorian of his 8th grade class, which is as far as public school went in New York City at the time. He actually goes off, and this is a story that I can perhaps tell a little later, to study to be an Episcopal priest. Now, how a Sicilian kid becomes an Episcopalian is the story, but I'll save that one for a little later. He goes off to study to be an Episcopal priest. He's 15 years old, and he's at his first semester at school, and he has to leave. His father has been injured in an industrial accident. His father was a shoemaker. He's injured in an industrial accident. His mother goes off to work in the sweatshop. He comes back to New York. He gets a job as a clerk in a solo practitioner's office on Wall Street. He then becomes a managing clerk. He then goes to night law school, not St. John's. It didn't exist at the time. He goes to New York Law School. He eventually, after 10 years, finally becomes a member of the bar. He eventually becomes a lawyer. He rises to the second position in charge of the DA's office in New York. And eventually, of course, he takes on Wall Street. So there's this great sort of underdog David and Goliath aspect to the story, which also comes from the fact that Pecora's name was Pecora, and Pecora was Italian. Now, you have to think back a little bit. You have to know a little bit about the history here. When Pecora comes to this country in the 1880s, it is a time of virulent anti-immigrant sentiment, much of it directed at these new and strange immigrants who are, for the first time, are coming in from southern and eastern Europe. There was a widespread belief that Italians, especially those Sicilians, were unintelligent, ungovernable criminals prone to violence at the slightest provocation. And there was violence. Labor and political violence permeated the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There were a small group of anarchists who used terrorist tactics to achieve their political aims. William McKinley was assassinated by an Eastern European anarchist. Italians were blamed for the bombing of Wall Street in the 1920s. There was Sacco and Vanzetti, of course. Some of those stereotypes of Italians had faded by the 1930s, but not all of them. And just before Pecora takes on Charles Mitchell, an Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Zangara tries to assassinate President-elect Franklin Roosevelt in Bayfront Park in Miami. Now, Time magazine, you remember Pecora was on the cover of Time magazine. I think an issue right at the end of February, beginning of March, Time does a little profile of Pecora. And they say, let me see if I can get this right, Pecora is the most accomplished lawyer of Italian extraction in the country. That was actually rather faint praise. Pecora becomes a lawyer in 1911, and I look back at the census reports from 1910. There were 15,000 lawyers in New York in 1910. 39 of them were Italian Americans. Now, there were probably some more who had anglicized their names, but Pecora was something of an oddity, even in the 1930s. Well, Time magazine writes this about Giuseppe Zangara, almost in the same breath that they're praising Pecora. Most illiterate Dagos have the killer instinct, especially when their animal comfort is disturbed. There was, as I point out in the book, no shortage of irony, and I think it was irony that was lost on no one in the 1930s, that this theoretically lawless Sicilian was showing the lawlessness of the Anglo-Saxons who ruled Wall Street. It was that irony, plus, of course, Pecora's skill and his ability to uncover the misdeeds of the rich and powerful, that turned him into such a media sensation back in 1933 and 1934. And I want to leave you with just one final quote to illustrate this point. This is from a profile written about Pecora in 1934 in the financial publication Barron's. Now, Pecora has been leading this investigation for about a year when this profile came out. I don't think you'd find anybody, maybe people would argue about whether this was a good idea or not, but I don't think you'd find anybody who said that Pecora was not an amazingly skillful attorney. So they opened their profile with this line: Ferdinand Pecora is a Sicilian who brought to American citizenship that dramatic instinct characteristic of the Latin race, but added to it in a somewhat larger measure than is frequent, a good brain. So that's the book. That's the Hellhound of Wall Street, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Do we have any written questions, any cards with questions? Since I forgot to tell people to do that.
Yes, sir. Joe Kennedy. So the question is, I'll just repeat it because I have the microphone. What role did Joe Kennedy play? It's an interesting role. At the end of the investigation, as the investigation is wrapping up, Congress passes the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which creates the SEC. Pecora, and as I read the history, I think this is very much a reaction to the stereotypes of the day. Pecora loved positions of acclaim and power because they legitimized him. They showed that the stereotypes, those lingering stereotypes about Italians being unintelligent and ungovernable criminals, really didn't apply to him. He was attracted to those positions. He desperately wanted to be the first chairman of the SEC. Roosevelt had some other ideas. Roosevelt, of course, was the consummate politician. And, the midterms elections are coming up now in 1934. And he's beat up on Wall Street for 2 years or so he figures, I got to mollify them a little bit. And so at the suggestion of one of his brain trust members, he picks as the first chairman of the SEC Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the future president. People were shocked and amazed because Joe Kennedy had developed a pretty secure reputation at this point of being precisely one of those market operators that the Securities and Exchange Commission was supposed to shut down. As a matter of fact, Pecora, near the end of the investigation, had been uncovering this stock pool, this manipulative pool that had tried to manipulate the stock of this particular company that made glass. Now, they were putting out the false notion that this company was going to make glass bottles in which alcohol was contained. Alcohol now back in play now that prohibition is over. And leading that pool was none other than Joseph P. Kennedy. So New Dealers were outraged. This is setting the wolf to guard the sheep, basically. And Pecora actually was furious, and there was kind of a showdown between the two of them at the first meeting of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Roosevelt's answer was, set a thief to catch a thief. That's what he said. And I have to say, on this score, Roosevelt was probably right. Kennedy did a pretty good job organizing this nascent administrative agency, and making it at least palatable to the people on Wall Street. He was a talented administrator. Pecora was appointed to the commission. He was one of the first commissioners. He was appointed to the shortest term, the one-year term on the commission. He didn't even last that long. Pecora has many skills. He was not an administrator. Governor Lehman actually appointed him to the bench in New York City, to the New York Supreme Court in early 1935. And Pecora took the job after only about 6 months at the SEC. Who would you have appointed to chair the investigation of the recent Wall Street debacle, and why? Would any commission be able to succeed in this political or economic climate? Let me take the second one first. These political moments, let me take a step back for a second. Financial reform, and I'm sure most of you can attest to this, for most people, financial reform is just boring. It is as dry as toast. Nobody really cares very much. And when you start talking about things like collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps, people go to sleep. I see this every day in my class. You also have to remember that the financial industry is the strongest lobbying industry in Washington. You know, people were talking about the healthcare lobby and healthcare reform. The healthcare lobby, those people are pikers compared to the financial industry. And in normal political times, the wind in Washington blows in just one direction. And that is in the direction either of, at a minimum, status quo, or preferably deregulation. And, you know, we've come to the end of a 30-year period of deregulation of the financial sector. There's only one thing that can overcome those political winds, and that's that combination of crisis and scandal. That's what Pecora had. Now, he had the skill and ability to take advantage of that moment he was handed. But those political moments, those moments in which real reform legislation can pass, are amazingly fleeting. They don't last very long. We squandered ours. We actually had it. Almost. Remember the Goldman Sachs hearings? Do you remember the Goldman Sachs hearings in Congress where we talked about all these lousy securities that Goldman Sachs sold? They were a big media circus, but the media circus didn't last very long because a lot of the real financial crisis, or at least the terror of the financial crisis, had already passed. Those hearings happened in the spring of 2010. To replicate what Pecora had back in the winter of 1933, when he put Citibank on the stand at precisely the moment the banking crisis hits, you would have had to have gone back in time and had those Goldman Sachs hearings not in the spring of 2010, but in the fall of 2008. If Lehman Brothers had just collapsed, if we had just bailed out AIG, if Fannie and Freddie had just been taken over by the government, if the commercial paper market had frozen up at just the time those hearings were happening, that's the confluence that Pecora had in 1933. We missed that political moment. Now, you know, we did other things. We passed health care. You know, other things happened, and maybe that was the right political choice. We'll see. History will tell us eventually. But by the time we turned to financial reform, a lot of political capital had been spent in Washington already. It was too late to really do anything that was equivalent to what happened in 1934. So that's the second question. The first question, who would you have appointed to chair the investigation of the recent Wall Street debacle? I think I'll pass on that. Yes, sir. You know, I tried to figure it out, and I don't precisely know. It was a plank in the Democratic platform that year in 1932. Roosevelt was going around that summer. He gave a speech in Ohio during his campaign in the summer of 1932, where he said, we really should regulate the sale of securities to the investing public. He referred to securities, and maybe this was from his own sketchy investment history. He said, a lot of times securities are wrapped up in these nice little packages with very pretty bows, but they turn out not to have much in them at the end of the day. And so one of the things that was a Democratic platform item in 1932 was the notion that we're going to regulate the sale of securities to the public. Now, Pecora he flirted with the bull moose progressives in the early 1900s, but he had been for 2 decades a loyal Democrat. And perhaps he simply got the idea from there. He said that he had just read on his way down to Washington that Charles Mitchell was about to leave the country. He was going to go to visit Italy and visit Mussolini and advise Mussolini on how to keep the value of the lira up. And so maybe that somehow played into his thinking about focusing on Citibank. I mean, Citibank was the biggest, most powerful commercial bank of the day. And they weren't the most powerful investment bank. That was J.P. Morgan. But they were the largest investment bank. They sold more securities than any other investment bank. There was one report that suggested that about 20% of the investment securities sold to the public were sold by National City Company. So it wasn't surprising once he said we're going to focus on the sale of securities to focus on Citibank, but still rather audacious. I mean, he only has a few weeks left to investigate this large, complex operation. And it's just remarkable to think about in this day and age, but it's a rather quaint notion that somehow we could subpoena Citibank at the end of January and that's what it was. It was January 30th, 1933 that they subpoenaed Citibank. Mitchell took the stand on February 21st. They investigated Citibank in 3 weeks and had some other hearings in the interim. So they really only had about 2 weeks to devote to Citibank. And somehow or another, he was able to pull off this investigation, and these hearings was just phenomenal.
And that was without the benefit of computers, all these other things.
Well, but then we generate less paper,
That's
too.
true, too. That's true, too.
Yes, sir.
Wondering what role, if any, criminal prosecutions play in the reforms that followed the Great Depression. And what got me thinking about this is maybe familiar with the recent article in Rolling Stone that talks about the crash in 2008 and implies that Wall Street is getting a pass on crimes that were committed that led to the 2008 crash.
There were some criminal prosecutions that came about as a result of this investigation. And again, I don't want to give away the whole book. So there were some criminal prosecutions. I won't tell you how they turned out. But actually relatively few. You have to remember that, at this point in time, a lot of this stuff wasn't illegal. There were no laws regulating these kinds of practices. And so what Pecora showed were these are practices that are going on. These are practices that the law now allows. We need to do something about that. And since Wall Street isn't willing to regulate itself, Washington should do it for them. And so, yeah, there was some notion. There was plenty of one of the things that's down in the National Archives in Washington are all these letters from various constituents coming into Norbeck, coming into Pecora. And, there were quite a few of them in those files that, wanted to take some bankers out at sunrise and shoot them, throw them in jail, preferably one with hard labor. I mean, there were a lot of letters like that. But if you look back on it, it turns out there weren't too many criminal prosecutions, in large part because a lot of the stuff wasn't illegal. No.
What resources such a short period of time
The Cora was an incredibly quick study. I mean, he didn't have a lot of formal education either, because he leaves school at 15. He's taken a handful of courses at City College. He actually doesn't even complete his law school education. You didn't actually have to graduate from law school at the time to sit for the bar. So he goes to law school for about a year. He kind of skips out on the second year. He doesn't have much formal education. Now, he's done some related kinds of cases as a prosecutor. He's done these prosecutions of what were called bucket shops, which were fraudulent securities operations. He's done some work involving the fraudulent sale of bonds by New York State. We won't go there. He's done that kind of thing. But really, he doesn't know much about the inner operations of Wall Street. Now, he's got some staffers who are helping him out a little bit, some people with a little bit of expertise. But basically, he goes down to Citibank's offices. He asks for the minute books of the board of directors meetings for the bank and for the securities affiliate. He's brought out this enormous stack of documents, and he spends the next 3 nights just reading these things. And that's most of what he based his questioning on. I mean, it's really remarkable.
Thank you very much. I want us to please give a warm round of applause to Professor Perino again, and to remind everyone that we have a reception back towards the J room immediately following.
Thank you very much.